The mock funeral. The next step in the work of deception was the invention of a mock funeral to influence public opinion in Russia and abroad. The official Soviet organ, Izvestia, according to a telegram from Moscow to the London Times on September 23, 1918, published the following account, false from start to finish. The body of the ex-Tsar, which had been buried in a wood at the place of execution, was exhumed, the grave having been found through information supplied by persons who were acquainted with the circumstances of the execution. The exhumation took place in the presence of many representatives of the supreme ecclesiastical authorities in Western Siberia, the local clergy, and delegates from the People's Army, Cossacks, and Czechoslovaks. The body was placed in a zinc coffin encased in a costly covering of Siberian cedar, and the coffin was exposed in the cathedral at Yekaterinburg under a guard of honor composed of the chief commanders of the People's Army. The body will be temporarily buried in a special sarcophagus at Omsk. The mock trial. Comment on this solemn farce is unnecessary. The last link in the chain of deception was forged with the holding of a mock trial a whole year later, in September 1919, owing to the pressure of public opinion and the gradual divulgation of the real facts. The Bolsheviks staged at Perm an ostensible, quote, trial, which aimed to clear them of all responsibility, despite the fact that they had officially approved the execution of the Tsar as regular. This, quote, trial is stated to have been held on September 17, 1919, in the House of Executive Committee of the Perm Soviet. The proceedings were reported in the Bolshevist paper Pravda as follows. The Revolutionary Tribunal has considered the case of the murder of the late Czar Nicholas Romanov, his wife, the Princess of Hesse, their daughters Olga, Tatiana, Marie, and Anastasia, and their suite. In all, 11 persons were assassinated. Of the 28 persons accused, 3 were members of the Yekaterinburg Soviet, Grusanov, Yakunatov, and Malutin. Among the accused were also 2 women, Maria Apraxina and Elizaveta Mironova. The account of the murder, as gathered from the material under the consideration of the Revolutionary Tribunal, is as follows. The Tsar and all the members of this entourage were shot. No mockery and no cruelties took place. Yakunatov admitted that he had organized the murder in order to throw the discredit of the crime on the Soviet authorities, whose adversary he became after having joined the socialist revolutionaries of the left wing. The plan of murdering the Tsar was conceived during the latter's stay at Tobolsk, but the Tsar was too strictly watched. In Yekaterinburg, when the Czechoslovak troops were approaching the town, the Soviet authorities were panic-stricken to such a degree that it was easy for him to avail himself of his position as chairman of the Extraordinary Commission for combating counter-revolution. The Tsar and his family, Yakunov admitted that he personally participated in the murder and that he took upon himself the responsibility for it. He, however, said that he was not responsible for the robbery of the belongings of the Tsar's family. According to his deposition, Czar Nicholas said before he died, "For the murder of the Tsar, Russia will curse the Bolsheviki." Grusanov and Malutin stated that they did not know anything about Yakunov's plans and only carried out his orders. Yakunatov was found guilty of the murder and sentenced to death. Grusanov, Malutin, Apraxina, and Mironova were found guilty of robbery committed on the murdered members of the Tsar's family. They were sentenced to death too. The death sentence was carried out the following day. Several objects belonging to the household of the Tsar were discovered with a thief named Kirachevsky, who stated that these things had been given to him by a man named Sorin, who was the chairman of the local Extraordinary Commission. At the time of the murder, Soren was the commander of a revolutionary battalion. Soren was a personal friend of Bela Borodov, who also participated in the assassination of the emperor. Not one of the names mentioned, except that of Belaborodov, says the publisher of this official account, bears any resemblance to any of the list of the 164 persons mentioned in the official dossier as having implicated in the crime, or even under suspicion. The 24 members of the Yekaterinburg Soviets of the Soviet are known. Not one of the men mentioned appeared on it. The name Yakovlev cannot be identified with that of Yurovsky. Belaborodov, stigmatized in the Pravda as a thief, has been promoted to the Sikh, the highest honor obtainable in Soviet Russia. For the very assassination for which he was subsequently denounced, and which, according to the official dossier of the investigation, he carried out at the order of the Sikh itself. With the concoction of a, quote, trial of the alleged murders of the whole imperial family working so declared to discredit the Soviet government, the whole solemn farce is complete, and the last effort of the Soviet government to clear its own skirts is consummated. Investigators' task completed. The long devoted, unremitting labors of Sokolov and the General Dietrichs to trace the history of the crime have been described in the October issue of Current History. Hundreds of witnesses were examined, hundreds of clues followed down, leading from the death chamber to the Ural wood where the bodies were destroyed. Having established, with the evidences of accomplices in the inspection of the, quote, death house, the fact that a murder had been committed, the investigating magistrate had either to find the bodies or to prove what had become of them. This proved to be a task of tremendous difficulty. Having located the scene of the destruction, it was necessary to obtain miners with pumping machinery, woodsmen, and surveyors to examine the shaft and study the ground. These new forces, as well as the necessary funds, were provided by the late Admiral Kolachek out of his own means. Under the orders and direction of General Dietrichs, a considerable force of White Guards was formed to carry out the necessary operations. The men were all miners and peasants versed in woodcraft from the Urals. Several hundreds camped around the Ganina Yama. These men worked with intense energy. All traces of the work of destruction were uncovered. The false bottoms of the shaft was revealed, the contents extracted with the infinite labor. There were literally hundreds of proofs now available, including many of the remaining jewels, articles of clothing, and other personal belongings of the murdered family. The complete collection was examined and classified by Sokolov. It is given in full in the dossier published in the Times. Many of the exhibits were afterward identified by witnesses. The whole crime thus stood at last revealed. All of the efforts of the Soviet government to cover up the facts and to absolve itself from guilt in connection with them are declared by this chronicler to have been demonstrated false by the relentless and innumerable evidences contained in the Sokolov dossier. The full story of how the Soviet authorities of Yekaterinburg consummated one of the most brutal regicides of history has been at least published to the entire civilized world. It will be left to the judgment of history after handing down the passionless, inexorable record of how the whole imperial family of the Romanovs was done to death by Bolshevist leaders in the basement room of the remote provincial town in Siberia, how their helpless bodies were hacked to pieces in an obscure wood, then burned and their ashes buried at the bottom of a mining shaft, and to decide finally and irrevocably whether or not, as these articles declare, the official government of Russia plotted the infamy and subsequently falsified by every means in its power the actual truth.